Hi. Just before we get started on advertising agents, a point I wanted to make before with respect to the power struggle between manufacturers, advertisers, and retailers. A little bit of this exists today in, for example, grocery stores. Grocery stores like Loblaws, Sobeys, etc. They have their own generic in-store brands. No Name is one example of that, one of the earliest ones. And generally speaking, Sobeys or Loblaws have higher profit margins from their own generic in-store brands, like for example, President's Choice with Loblaws. And so the question asks, well, if they make more money selling their own products, why even bother with those brand name goods like Tide, for example, from Procter and Gamble? And of course, the answer is that if people are going into Loblaws, in part they may well buy a lot of generic in-store brands. Sure, that can happen. But they're also going in there looking for very specific types of branded goods as well, like Tide. And if Tide is not available, they go elsewhere, right? So one of the things to think about are those situations in which people, when you find yourself in a grocery store or some other type of large retailer, to think about the trade-off or the balance between the in-store brands that are there and the outside kind of manufactured branded goods that are sold there, and to what extent do you visit a grocery store, for example, with a express purpose to buy specific branded goods as opposed to just seeing what's the most affordable or what's the best buy that you can make. All right. Okay, so now we want to look at advertising agents, and this was a category of business that comes on in the mid to late 1800s. Okay, so here's an example of an early advertising agent, George Roll, and he specialized in the New England area. He starts his business in 1865. And one of the things he found, and again, he's one of the first advertising agents, right? So he's coming on, he realizes that there are more and more companies that are wanting to do more and more advertising, but they don't necessarily have expertise in terms of buying advertising space in newspapers or magazines or whatever. So he starts to realize there's a few things that that he's able to gain expertise in. And one, he looks at a number of newspapers in the New England area, and he realized that the line rate, and that's the way of describing what advertising is cost per line. So it's basically just the kind of mechanism they use to determine what you would pay for advertising. A line of newspaper equals X amount of money. So he found that the line rates for advertising in different newspapers could really vary a lot. There were sort of a rate that they charged for local businesses, a different one for businesses from outside the area. They might charge a different rate for government to advertise. They could charge a different rate for friends and family, et cetera, et cetera. And he found that at different times of the year, the advertising rates would vary. And so he came up with this idea that he could basically approach a number of newspapers and buy up in advance, buy up chunks of their paper, and saying, I will buy up 5 pages of the newspaper on these days in the future, and 6 pages on these days in the future, et cetera, et cetera. And he effectively becomes a kind of wholesaler of white space. And that means that he's basically going to the newspaper and saying, if you let me buy chunks of your newspaper up where advertising would normally go, I'm going to get a discounted rate for that because I'm buying in bulk, so to speak. And I'm going to turn around and sell pockets of that space I've just bought from you to individual companies and advertisers. So in that sense, he becomes a space jobber. Like the space is the white space in the papers that he's buying. A jobber is another term for a wholesaler. And so his thinking or his goal is to buy in bulk and to try and get the lowest price. And then he can turn around and sell a half-page ad, for example, to say Procter and Gamble or something like that, And because he's bought in advance, he's bought at the lowest price because he's bought in bulk, he's actually in some cases able to give Procter & Gamble a better rate than would be the case if Procter & Gamble dealt directly with the newspaper itself. Okay, so that's the idea of a space jobber coming along. And what you see are a number of other types of space jobbers starting up in the 1870s and 80s. One example, Lord and Thomas, they tended to specialize with religious publications. J. Walter Thompson, this would become one of the later would become one of the more important ad agents, and they specialized in magazines, so doing something similar to what we saw before, but with just a focus on magazines and the rest. Now these tended to be what were called closed contracts, and that means that someone like J. Walter Thompson would effectively just have a relationship with a number of magazines, and would only deal with those magazines. So if you were Procter & Gamble and you approached J. Walter Thompson and you wanted to have him place your advertisements because he's bought in bulk and he can sell you that ad space for less than if you did yourself, that might be fine and good. But effectively, you could only deal with the magazines that J. Walter Thompson had a contractual relationship with. And in that sense, they were what were called a closed contract. They were not open in the sense that you could kind of seek out advertising in virtually any magazine or newspaper, whatever the case may be. So people like J. Walter Thompson were aligned with magazines primarily, and the others would have been aligned with newspapers primarily. Their primary relationship was with the media, the print media itself. And in fact, some of the newspapers, for example, if an ad agent were able to purchase X amount of advertising space in a given month, they might be given a rebate, or they would be given some kind of a financial incentive to do that in some ways. So in some ways, they didn't work directly for the newspapers, but they had a primary close relationship with those newspapers or magazines in this sense. Now, there's a similar thing today where if you go into a bank and say, I want to get some financial advice about investing some of my money in terms of mutual funds or whatever the case may be, that bank person will present themselves as a kind of objective information source, as somebody who's going to provide you with information about different types of mutual funds or different types of investments. But in actual fact, that bank employee or the bank actually has close relations with certain types of mutual funds, and many of them are, of course, bank-owned. And so the incentive for them is to put you into those funds and not necessarily into the funds that offer the best deal or the lowest management fees or something like that. I think there are other types of examples like that when you were to go into a travel agency and talk to a travel agent and say, I'm looking to do this trip that would have me go through Europe and North Africa or whatever, and what kinds of travel companies should I be looking at? They're not necessarily going to look at all of the travel companies that can provide a trip like that. They're going to just mostly deal with the ones in which they have a kind of relationship. And so when they do that, those agents are compensated by those agencies. Those agents are compensated by those travel companies because of that prior relationship. So you can see on the one hand, it's it would be fine for Procter & Gamble in one sense, but they're limited, right, in terms of what kinds of publications they can deal with in this model. Now someone else comes along, and his name is A.J. Ayer, and he founds an agency called N.W. Ayer and Son. N.W. was actually his father, and he's the son. And even though his father didn't work with him, he liked his dad so much that he named the agency after him. But anyway, so N.W. Ayer and Son comes along. And in some respects, this is one of the first modern advertising agencies. And I'll go into that in more detail in a second. But the first thing they implemented was what they called the open contract. And essentially what that means is that Ayer said, I'm not just going to my starting point is not going to be I'm going to develop this relationship with a bunch of newspapers or magazines to buy white space from them. And then after I've done that, I'm going to sort of find some advertisers who want to buy that space from me. His starting point was with the advertisers. It was with the Procter and Gamble's and the Kellogg's. And he basically approached them and said, I want to work with you as an ad agent. I'm going to develop, or I have expertise in newspaper advertising, magazine advertising, and I want to work with you, and you tell me what types of newspapers, what types of magazines you think you would want to have for your ad campaign. And then I will just go out and secure that advertising for you. And I will do it in ways that will probably make it cheaper if I do it because of my expertise than if you were to do that yourself on your own. And what he also came up with is a new kind of compensation model called the commission system. And basically what that means is that that Ayer basically said, I'm going to do all this work. And let's say I place $100,000 of advertising for you. Then what my payment will be 15% of that. And I'll make $15,000. In some cases, that would actually come mostly from the newspapers. Some cases, it would be from the advertiser, and it would be kind of a mix. But effectively, that's a commission system, right? Whatever amount of advertising he's able to place, he would get a 15% fee for that. And that commission system becomes the dominant form of payment for advertisers and advertising agencies right up until about the 1980s and 90s. Now, what were the functions of these ad agents? So what they had to know a few things, right? I mean, the one, they had to gain a knowledge of all these newspapers that existed. You know, as I said before, more than 2,000 daily newspapers and then magazines and the rest. So they had to actually do research in terms of understanding what those newspapers, which ones existed, what was their readership, like how many readers did they have, what type of readers, was it a newspaper that was aligned with the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, et cetera, et cetera. So just gaining knowledge of the newspaper and magazine markets becomes important in that sense. And then, of course, when they were actually going and buying the ad space, or in the case of Ayer, working with an advertiser to do that, they were always trying to get the lowest prices, right? And in some cases, they got lower prices because they bought in bulk. In other cases, they got lower prices just because they learned a lot about those newspapers, and they learned that certain newspapers are really going to cut their rates in January as opposed to before Christmas, et cetera, et cetera. So they would gain all this knowledge about the newspaper trade, the newspaper industry in general, how to get the lowest prices. And then they would actually do the media buying. So that would be if, in fact, Procter & Gamble commissioned them to do a $100,000 ad campaign, they would have to sort of select the newspapers or magazines and actually do the buying, placing the ads. Notice we haven't even talked about designing the ads. That actually comes later. In the early going, Procter & Gamble and a lot of companies actually designed their own ads. They did their own ad copywriting. What comes first is the media buying, and in terms of the work of the ad agents. So you typically had, in these early media buying type of ad agencies, you had a group that were the researchers, and those are the ones I just mentioned in terms of investigating the newspaper or magazine market. Then you had the space buyers. Those are the ones that actually made the deal, actually bought the specific ad space and specific newspapers, trying to get the best price, etc. And then you had a category called the checkers. And these were people that were there to verify that the advertising that you had placed, in fact, ran on the dates it was supposed to run, that the ad was the size it was supposed to be in the newspaper, et cetera, et cetera. And like I said before, if you're Procter & Gamble, let's say you're in Cincinnati or Philadelphia or wherever, and you're running ads for your products throughout the country, you want to have somebody there checking to make sure that the ads that you ran in, say, an Arizona newspaper or an Oregon newspaper or whatever, that in fact those ads did run. And those are what the checkers did. So by the early 1900s, Ayer and Son is what's called a full service agency, full service ad agency. So it's a fairly large ad agency. You can see there it has about 160 employees, 12 different departments. And you see a whole host of different types of job categories that are developing too. I mean, the first order would be the account executives. So those are people like Don Draper in Mad Men, the people that the person who works at the ad agency who deals with the client, right? Who often deals with, say, the marketing director, say at Procter and Gamble or something like that, represents the ad agency, represents a particular account, and it's called the account executive. They had those. Ayer & Son also had copywriters, now art directors. So now by the early 1900s, Ayer & Son are actually starting to do the ad writing, which is called copywriting, for their clients, and is doing the art, the artwork that would go with ads as well for their clients. Prior to this, typically advertisers, manufacturer advertisers, either they hired somebody to do their advertising in-house, somebody who was outside the agents, outside the firm, or they had in-house people doing it. More and more, though, ad agencies will actually take on the work of copywriting and doing art direction and all the rest for the ads. Okay, and that's a hallmark feature of a full-service ad agency, right? It's not just the media buying; now it's also the copywriting. The other point about Ayer & Son that's really important were the types of clients they had. I mean, you can see here Procter and Gamble is one, hires root beer. There are lots and lots of clients. They would not take patent medicine accounts, and they would not take alcohol accounts. And again, this ties in with this idea about legitimacy in advertising. Ayer & Son did not want patent medicine accounts because he thought patent medicines were a socially illegitimate type of endeavor, right? They were tarnished. And he did not want to be associated with them because he did not want the early business of ad agencies being linked to something that was also linked to Barnum or patent medicines or things like that. He wouldn't take alcohol accounts because in the early 1900s there was a strong prohibition and temperance movement as well in the US and in Canada. And so alcohol was a controversial product, and so he steered clear of that. But then the final aspect of the full service agency aspect of Ayer & Son was the start of market research that the company would start doing. So they weren't just going to sort of media buy, they weren't just going to provide the ads. They also started doing research in terms of what types of products and what types of markets and what types of consumers existed in, say, the United States. And in that case, they would do various types of reports, research reports they would provide for their clients. And I just got one example there of an annual newspaper annual that they did starting in the 1880s. So number one here was the early model, the one that I mentioned with J. Walter Thompson and the like. And that was, you started, really it was the sort of publisher that mattered most. The agent would work with the publisher and the agency together. They would then approach the advertiser, and then ultimately the advertiser would try and connect with the consumer through the advertising. Number two is more modern situation, something that would be similar to the way advertising would be throughout most of the 20th century. And here, the agent starts initially or directly with the advertiser, with the Procter and Gamble. And they start with them. That's the client. They work for the client. The agency is then part of that, the next sequence of the chain. And then it's the agency, the ad agent, that then approaches the media publisher with the advertising and makes the buy. And then ultimately it's the consumer that sees the advertising through there. So that's the sequence that you would see for the more modern version of the relationship between advertisers, ad agents, and media. Okay, so I want to move on to another theme here, and that has to do with, so you've got these ad agents, right? And they're in the case of a full service agency like Ayer and Son, they're doing media buying, they're doing some initial market research, and they're doing lots of copywriting. So the question is, well, what kind of copywriting should you be doing? Like, what kind of advertising would work the best? What's the most effective? What's the most persuasive? And you can imagine there's a lot of head scratching that goes into that thinking, right? We're going to spend all this money buying newspaper space for advertising. We damn well should try and ensure that the ad copy that goes in there is seen as the most effective, the most persuasive, the type of copy that would most engender sales. And so in this course, we'll look at this relationship between sort of the science of advertising, the kind of research-oriented approach to doing advertising, and also the creative side of advertising, an emphasis on the creativity of advertising and not sort of scientifically predetermining what works best or not. And the image I have here is of Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. And I think Leonardo da Vinci is a good kind of exemplar of this tension between science and art, because of course da Vinci was himself a scientist, a mathematician, but he was also an exceptional artist, right? The Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. So we want to think about advertising as this amalgam, this kind of place where science and creativity kind of intersect at various points in terms of the development of advertising. At certain times, science and research will play more importance in terms of the thinking around advertising. At other times, creativity will tend to predominate in terms of what motivates manufacturers to do various things in their advertising. Okay, so we're going to look at the science. But before we do that, we want to look at sort of different schools of copywriting and ultimately ones that are influenced by science. The first example I have here, though, is not really so much a scientific approach. It's a kind of sort of commonsensical approach to advertising copywriting. And here we'll be talking more about like schools of copywriting. So the first one I want to look at is a guy named John Powers. And in the 1890s, he's a door-to-door salesman. And he does that kind of selling for a few years. And then he moves into advertising. And he started to reflect on what type of advertising copy would work best. And he drew upon his experience as a door-to-door salesman, a face-to-face salesman. And he felt that some of the things that work best in terms of being that type of salesman, which should also work well in terms of doing advertising copy. So his thinking here was that you wanted to have a very informative, rational, straightforward appeal to people in the advertising that you had. Effectively said you would just give the people a reason why the product was very good or the best. You give them a reason why, saying why it's true, and then they'd be more likely to be influenced by an informative, rational, straightforward approach, presenting reasons why for a product, as opposed to something that was seductive or flashy along those lines. He thought you should just appeal to the ability of people to sort of, consciously deliberate on something, to employ their own kind of mode of reasoning, and that as long as the product was good, and as long as the ad copy sort of facilitated that type of conscious deliberation, then you would be successful in sales. And so his mantra was pretty straightforward. It was, as he said, state firmly what the product does and how it will benefit the buyer. And as long as the product was a good one and the benefits were clearly demonstrated in terms of the advertising, then you would have success. Now, this has been called reason why. We don't really see a whole lot of reason why advertising anymore. I just threw one example up here. And as we'll be talking about, most advertising today doesn't really function this way in terms of engaging you in terms of reason and deliberation or conscious thinking like that. It tends to target emotions more, and it tends to try to situate us within a lifestyle presentation of a sort and things like that. So this is the approach from Powers, as I say, try to emulate the kind of personal rapport you might have between a shopkeeper or a salesman that you met in the door, and focus on the product, and then focus on the benefits that the product can bring to the user. Now, other forms of copywriting developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, coming out of psychology, professional psychology. And psychology as a discipline really only gets started in the late 1800s in terms of there being like psychology departments in universities and the rest. So psychology it was sort of an outgrowth of philosophy beginning in the late 1800s. And it was essentially, philosophers would be looking at forms of reasoning and logic and those sorts of things. But psychologists were more interested in sort of the way the brain worked and the way behavior kind of came out of mental processes and these sorts of things. They weren't necessarily interested so much in logic or reason and the rest. And so they very much were empirically minded with respect to how people think and how they behave. And so they also drew from science and medicine, and they would be doing various types of studies starting in the late 1800s to gain a psychological understanding for people's motivations, for their thinking, and for their behavior. And so what you start to see is by the early 1900s, there are quite a few psychology departments that start in universities in the United States and then later Canada. And in these psychology departments, you started to see professors, psychologists, that started to turn to the question of advertising and to see what was effective about certain forms of advertising or others. So here's one example, an early one. This is one of the earliest psychologists doing this. His name's Harlow Gale. And he's asking a simple question in the 1890s in terms of his work. What makes an ad noticeable or memorable or even persuasive or believable? These sorts of basic questions. And what he came up with is he wanted to come up with experiments and studies that would try and determine this. So he had an interest in eye tracking, so like looking at how if people had a newspaper in front of them to see where their eyes were immediately drawn to on the newspaper, and so some studies like that. But in terms of advertising effectiveness, his studies that he did that were more germane to that had to do with a certain kind of study that he did, and that was where he would get these research subjects, and they were often psychology undergraduate students, because you have to actually do that when you're a psychology student, like participate in research studies. But he would get these students or other people to be part of these research studies, and he'd say to them, okay, imagine you've moved to a new city, and you need to buy new goods, new things, new products or whatever. Remember what I said before about when you're in a city, you're more inclined to be buying more things? So Gale picked up on that and sort of said, okay, students, imagine you're in this new city, you've got to buy new goods, and you're going to make the decision on those goods based on the information that's presented to you in the ads that you're going to be shown. And he made these sort of fake ads with fictitious brand names and stuff, and these were various types of products. It could be a soap, it could be a piano, it could be furniture, whatever the case may be. So he had all these ads, and then he would the ads would also have different types of persuasive styles. So one ad might be sort of focused on price. Another ad might have a celebrity testimonial. Another ad might emphasize the reputation of the company that was making the product, etc., etc. And so he had the students, the research subjects, kind of go through all these ads, and then they had to sort of rank in importance those ads that basically were the most influential to them, the ones that were the most persuasive. And this was the order of merit technique, where you're going through and you're asking people to sort of tell you which ads they believe were that you would buy these products based on what was in the ads itself. Just the information you get from the ads, not from nothing else. Now, that's often referred to as an idealist approach versus a behaviorist approach. Idealist in this case means you're asking the research subjects themselves to say what they would do with that information not necessarily what they did, which would be the behavioralist approach. And so to get at that behavior side, because ultimately you don't just want to know what people think are good ads and bad ads, or how they rank them low or high. You also want to know if, in fact, ads using that method generate sales at a high rate or a low rate. And so others started taking up the order of merit, but more in a kind of behaviorist way. And that means you're looking at actual buying behavior. So H.L. Hollingsworth, a bit later in the 1910s and 20s, he developed his own kind of comparative order of merit method. Similar kind of thing. You get people in, you show them different types of ads. They rank in importance those ads that they felt were the most persuasive or the most likely to result in a buy. You use, in this case, he would use real brand names, real products, not fictional ones. And so he would take that information, but he was using ads that were also running in local newspapers. And he would take the information that those research subjects provided him about the order of merit, and then he would compare that to actual sales in the local area. He would get the sales information from those companies, and he would compare how those sales corresponded to what people were saying. In some cases, somebody might say, well, I like this ad because it emphasizes price, and that's a kind of an economic indicator, and it's a rational choice to buy something that's it's a good price, etc. And you might rank that ad very high in terms of what the research subjects say about the ads. But in fact, he may find that that product that was using a price appeal sold very poorly in the marketplace based on the actual ads that were out there. And in that way, it's a good kind of way to understand that behavior, in terms of actual buying, does not always correspond to what you say is preferential for something. Okay, so out of this type of research, you started to see more of what were called sort of general laws of copywriting, the ways to knowing when to emphasize price, when to emphasize a celebrity endorsement, or when to emphasize a certain type of logic or reason, and when to do emotion, or these sorts of things. And you would see, in the case of Hollingsworth, dozens of studies like the one I just described that were being done, and others as well that were doing similar types of things. Now, this was probably the most influential psychologist in terms of his writings on advertising, Walter Dill Scott. And it's particularly his theory of suggestion. He wrote an influential book in 1904 called The Theory of Advertising, which incorporated a lot of the research he'd been doing on this. And one thing to keep in mind is that these psychologists that I've been mentioning were somewhat connected to the business world. Some cases they had kind of outside consultancies where they would work with companies, in terms of offering advice on advertising. Their studies were written up in the advertising trade press as well. So they were not just stuck in an ivory tower somewhere. They were fairly interactively engaged with the business world. Now, Scott had an idea, his premise, his central idea was that the consumers, on the whole, were not rational. And they were, in effect, suggestible to what he described as the power of the copywriter, that they were not only not rational, but they were suggestible, that they could be easily influenced by effective, powerful copywriting, by effective ad design. At one point, he says that advertising, and I'm quoting him, is essentially the same social process as hypnotism. Now, I think that's an obvious overstatement. I think that's a little bit of hyperbole. But his thinking here was that the way that the hypnotist is able to sort of you take a person, you kind of relax them, you make them sort of open to suggestion through the setting of the hypnotism, and then the successful hypnotist is able to sort of hypnotize them and then to make them do things that they otherwise wouldn't do. He thought that advertising could operate in that realm, not necessarily as powerful as an actual hypnotist, but he thought it had some similarity. So in that line, what he thought was there was a kind of direct command that an advertisement could convey, and that people would be suggestible to those sorts of commands or the power that's conveyed in the advertising. That power would come through effective persuasive techniques. It's not just about providing information like Powers believed. You just provided information about an ad and sort of basic reasons. The persuasive techniques were more wrapped up in things like the aesthetics of the ad, the design of the ad, the use of color. One of the things that starts to happen in the early 1900s is that magazines, not newspapers, but magazines can use color in their advertising. And he felt that magazines were just a much better place for your advertisements because of the rich aesthetic basis for ads that could run in color with higher printing capacities, higher resolution printing as well, that magazines use as opposed to newspapers. And then the other point that's really germane, central to what Scott was talking about was the role of women in all of this thinking. So his premise was that women were more suggestible, more easily persuaded than men were. And I'm going to read you what he wrote with respect to that. It's a bit kind of wordy, but he said, women decide after this fashion more frequently than men. If a lady were debating the question as to which goods she should order, an appeal to the artistic and sentimental might awaken her emotional nature sufficiently to cause her to decide, and that which awakens the emotion would be likely to be chosen. So it's this idea that they're prone to sort of artistic rendition, the sentimental, and emotion. Now, we'll come back to that in a second in terms of the emotional factor here, but by the 1910s and 20s, the prevailing view amongst advertisers and marketers was that women comprised about 80% of consumer purchases. And this was especially the case in cities. So by the 1920s, you have mostly men who are Procter and Gamble and these other types of manufacturer advertisers. It's mostly men working in the ad agencies. But the people they're targeting are the perception is anyway, that they're predominantly female. And it's a change that happens over time. So this perception that 80% of your consumers are female by the 20s, that was not the thinking in the 1870s or 80s. I mean, back then, if you think of like most people are living on farms, and if they were to go shopping, let's say on the weekend, they might, get in the horse and buggy and ride into town, both the husband and the wife, maybe the kids. And it would be like man and woman actually buying stuff in that day and then bringing it back to the home. In the home, that's also where the man worked and the woman worked, right? The man maybe more in terms of the actual agricultural farming work and the woman doing other types of work in the homestead. So the home was not necessarily gender divided, right? And in terms of where the work happened and where the home life was. You get to the 1920s, more people living in cities. If you look at actual, say, married couples or families, you're more likely to find a man who works outside of the home, a woman who works inside of the home, although many of them also had part-time jobs as well, or even full-time jobs. But the prevailing view is that the woman in the home was the so-called purchasing agent for the household. She did most of the buying. And whether that was soap or food or clothes, even like razor blades, which were for men, but women were often seen as the ones who would buy those things. So that's the prevailing view. Okay? So it means that the way to understand consumers is not generic in terms of gender, right? You have, like, according to these advertisers, you had to understand women in a very specific way as opposed to men. And so these male advertisers then often portrayed women as especially prone to emotion, and that it was not through logic and reason and argument that you got to them, that you targeted their emotions or their sentiments, these sorts of things. And in fact, they went one step further, and Scott does this, and we're going to talk a lot about this next week. They were not just that they were sort of more influenced by emotion than, say, reason. They even said that they were irrational, that they somehow had a kind of deficit or incapability of engaging in reason the way men could. Now, this is part and parcel of social prejudice that exists at this time with respect to women, right? Women, in 1920, women first get the vote in the United States, and for Canada, it's around the same time. So they couldn't own property to the same extent as men could. We're only voting in 1920. A whole host of factors that did not have women treated as equal to men in public life. And so that kind of prejudicial, that sort of discriminatory way of dealing with women sort of carries over into advertising. And you will see many advertisers, when they're thinking about targeting women, their starting point is generally thinking about how do we appeal to them emotionally, and how do we understand them even as irrational people, and how do we sometimes even scare them or frighten them or target them with those kind of negative emotions to get them to buy our products. So next week we'll talk about that. We'll look at some specific ad campaigns around Listerine and others that targeted women in this respect. All right, take care.